Hello. Welcome, dear dreamers, and welcome back to Sleepy Legends. Tonight, we're embarking on a magical journey into the realm of fairies. Irish fairies, to be exact. Those ethereal beings who have danced through human imagination for thousands of years. Before you settle into your most comfortable pillow, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. You would be doing me a favor. Please leave me a comment and let me know what part of the world you are sleeping in tonight. I read all my comments. So settle into your most comfortable and relaxing body position. Let your breathing slow and deepen, and allow yourself to drift into the enchanted world that exists just beyond the veil of our everyday perception. Close your eyes if you haven't already, and imagine a twilight forest where the last rays of sunlight filter through ancient oak trees, painting everything in shades of gold and lavender. It is in places like this, in the liminal spaces between day and night, between the human world and the wild, where fairies have always made their home. Fairy traditions span virtually every corner of the globe, each culture contributing its own unique vision of these magical beings to humanity's collective imagination. The Celtic peoples of Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and Brittany developed perhaps the most elaborate fairy mythology. There are so many fairy traditions that tonight we will explore one particular type of fairy, the Ishi. In the Green Isle of Ireland, the Ishi, meaning people of the mounds in Irish Gaelic, are among the most powerful and complex beings in Celtic mythology. Unlike the tiny whimsical fairies of Victorian imagination, the Ishi are formidable supernatural entities, typically human-sized or larger, who command both respect and fear from those who know their lore. These beings are intrinsically connected to the ancient landscape of Ireland. They dwell within the grass-covered burial mounds, earthen forts, and megalithic passage tombs that dot the Irish countryside like sleeping giants. These structures, built by Neolithic peoples thousands of years ago, became in Irish mythology the hidden palaces and kingdoms of the Ishi. Magnificent halls hidden within the hollow hills where time flows differently and eternal feasting and music fill the air. The origin of the Ishi is debated within Irish mythology itself. The most prominent tradition, preserved in medieval texts like the Book of Invasions, identifies them as the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, a race of godlike beings who once ruled Ireland openly. When the mortal Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish, invaded and conquered the island, the Tuatha De Danann were given a choice by the poet Amergin. They could have the land above ground or below it. They chose the hidden world beneath, retreating into the She Mounds where they became the Ishi, ruling an invisible parallel Ireland that exists alongside the mortal world. This makes the Ishi neither demons nor angels, but rather displaced deities, former gods who once walked openly in daylight but now inhabit a twilight realm. They retain their immense power, their magic, their proud nobility, but they exist now in a state of exile from the surface world that was once theirs. This lends them a certain melancholy grandeur in Irish folklore. They are not malicious by nature, but they are touchy about respect, fiercely protective of their territory, and occasionally resentful of the mortals who displaced them. The Ishi are organized into courts and kingdoms beneath their respective mounds. Each major she has its own ruler. The Dagda dwells in Brú-na-Bóinne, Newgrange, while other famous she include Knock Enya in County Limerick, home to the goddess Enya, and Knocknarea in Sligo, said to contain the tomb of Queen Medb. These kingdoms maintain their own hierarchies, feuds, alliances, and politics, mirroring and sometimes intersecting with mortal Irish society. The relationship between humans and the she is governed by unwritten but ironclad rules of respect and reciprocity. They demand courtesy, offerings, and above all, that their spaces be left undisturbed. Farmers traditionally left certain fields uncultivated if they contained a fairy fort, and solitary hawthorn trees, standing in fields, believed to mark fairy meeting places or paths, were never cut down. To violate these spaces was to invite disaster. Crops would fail, cattle would sicken, children would fall ill, or worse calamities would befall the offender. Yet the she could also be beneficent. They might reward kindness with good fortune, bestow musical talent on those they favored, or provide warnings of impending danger. They were known to value beauty, music, poetry, and honor, the same things the ancient Irish nobility prized. Indeed, the parallel between the she and the human aristocracy was intentional. Both were warriors, both held elaborate feasts, both valued lineage and honor above all. The appearance of the she is one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of Irish fairy lore, because the answer depends enormously on context, the particular type of she being described, the time period of the account, and crucially, whether they were choosing to reveal their true forms or were cloaked in glamour, the magical illusion that allowed them to appear however they wished. In their true unglamoured state, the she were described as beings of overwhelming presence and beauty, but a beauty that was distinctly other, not quite human, uncanny in ways that could be as unsettling as it was attractive. Contrary to the Victorian notion of tiny, delicate fairies, the traditional Irish she were human-sized or larger. Many accounts describe them as being tall, taller than most humans. In fact, the fairy nobility in particular were often said to stand head and shoulders above mortal men, commanding and imposing in their physical presence. There are accounts from the medieval period describing encounters where the fairy folk appeared as a people of great stature, or as being of noble height. This makes sense given their identity as the former gods of Ireland. Deities wouldn't be expected to be diminutive. However, there's an interesting variation in the tradition. Some accounts suggest that the she could appear at whatever size suited them, shifting from human height to towering giants to small enough to slip through a keyhole. This shape-shifting ability was part of their fundamental nature. They weren't locked into a single physical form the way mortals are. There's also a strand of folklore that suggests the she were gradually diminishing over time, becoming smaller as they faded from the world with the decline of belief in them. The medieval she were said to be tall and lordly. By the 18th and 19th centuries, some accounts describe them as smaller, though still adult-sized rather than tiny. This diminishment theory may reflect changing cultural attitudes more than actual tradition, but it appears consistently enough in folklore collections to be worth noting. The faces of the Ishi were described as preternaturally beautiful, but with something subtly wrong about them. Features that were almost but not quite human, beautiful but alien. Their eyes were most frequently remarked upon. Accounts describe fairy eyes as being unusually large, luminous, and penetrating. Eyes that seem to see through you, into you, reading your thoughts and intentions. The color varied by account. Some said the Ishi had eyes like stars, silver or gold. Others described them as having eyes of impossible blue or green, colors more vivid than any found in nature. Still others said their eyes were dark and fathomless, like looking into deep wells or a night sky. What was consistent was the quality of their gaze. People who claimed to have seen the Ishi said that meeting their eyes was almost unbearable, not because the eyes were frightening in themselves, but because of the awareness behind them, the sense of vast age and knowledge, of intelligence that operated on levels mortals couldn't comprehend. One account describes it as looking into eyes that had seen the world before Christ, before Patrick, before the Milesians came to Ireland, eyes that remembered when the Tuatha De Danann walked openly under the sun. Their other features were typically described as fine and aristocratic. High cheekbones, straight noses, well-formed mouths. But there was something about the proportions that wasn't quite right, though witnesses struggled to articulate exactly what. Features that were individually perfect, but that fit together in ways that created an overall impression of strangeness. One account describes it as faces that were too symmetrical, too perfect, lacking the small flaws that make a human face real. Some traditions held that the Ishi had slightly pointed ears, though this detail is more prominent in later literary accounts than in the oldest folklore. It may be a detail imported from Germanic elf traditions rather than genuinely Irish. The skin of the Ishi was almost universally described as pale, not the healthy paleness of fair-skinned humans, but an otherworldly pallor, luminous and strange. Some accounts describe it as having a faint glow or shimmer as if lit from within. Others say it looked like marble or alabaster, smooth and cool, and somehow not quite alive in the way human skin is alive. This pallor makes sense if we remember that the Ishi dwelt beneath the hollow hills, in underground palaces where no sunlight reached. They were creatures of twilight and moonlight, not of day. However, there are also accounts of Ishi with darker coloring. Some fairy folk were described as having green-tinged skin, particularly those associated with water or forests. Others were said to have golden or bronze skin that seemed to capture and hold light. The fairy nobility might appear in any coloring that suited them, while lesser fairy folk tended toward the pale, underground dweller appearance. Hair color varied enormously. Golden hair, like Niamh's, was associated with fairy royalty and great beauty. But there are accounts of Ishi with hair as black as midnight, or silver white like moonlight, or red as copper or fire, or even green like growing things. Some descriptions say their hair moved as if in a constant breeze, even when the air was still, or that it seemed to float around them like they were underwater. The bodies of the Ishi were described as idealized human forms, perfectly proportioned, graceful, strong without being bulky. The men were typically described as having warriors' builds, tall and lean and powerful, moving with a fluid grace that no mortal could match. They seemed almost weightless, their footsteps making no sound, their movements flowing like water or wind. The women were described in terms that emphasized both beauty and an almost frightening perfection. Slender but not fragile, graceful but with a sense of coiled strength beneath the beauty, moving with an otherworldly elegance that made mortal women seem clumsy by comparison. But this perfection itself could be unsettling. They were described as being too beautiful, in a way that was disturbing rather than attractive. It was an inhuman beauty, lacking the small imperfections and asymmetries that make human beauty warm and approachable. Looking at them was said to be almost painful, like staring at something too bright. One of the most consistent details across accounts is that the Ishi seemed to be sources of light themselves. They glowed, faintly or brightly depending on circumstance and power. This wasn't the warm, steady glow of firelight or candlelight, but something cooler and more ethereal. Moonlight given form, starlight made flesh. This luminescence was stronger in some Ishi than others. The great fairy lords and ladies shone brightly enough to cast shadows. Lesser fairy folk might have only the faintest shimmer about them. The light was described as silver or golden or sometimes green, and it was this light that allowed mortals to see the fairy raids at night. Great processions of glowing figures moving through the darkness. Some accounts suggest this light was connected to their emotional state, burning brighter when they were angry or excited, dimming when they wished to pass unnoticed. It was perhaps a manifestation of the magical power that saturated their very beings. An important aspect of Ishi appearance is that what mortals typically saw was not their true form, but rather glamour, magical illusion that allowed the fairy folk to appear however they wished. A fairy might appear as a beautiful young person, but be actually an ancient being whose true form was something else entirely. The famous story of the midwife and the fairy ointment illustrates this perfectly. When the midwife accidentally got fairy ointment in her eye, she could suddenly see through glamour, and what had appeared as a magnificent palace was revealed to be the inside of a hollow hill. And the beautiful fairy folk appeared in their true forms, which the stories tantalizingly never quite describe, leaving us to wonder what she actually saw that was so different from the illusion. Those who gained the sight to see through glamour often reported disturbing discrepancies. Someone who appeared young and beautiful might be revealed as ancient and withered, or vice versa. Beautiful clothes might be revealed as cobwebs or leaves. A magnificent horse might be revealed as something else entirely. Some accounts suggest sticks or rushes magically animated. The implication is that the true forms of the Ishi might be quite different from their glamoured appearances, and possibly not beautiful at all by human standards, or beautiful in ways that human minds struggle to process and remember. The Ishi were particularly active at liminal times, Samhain, November 1st, and Beltane, May 1st, when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. On these nights, the she mounds were said to open, revealing the magnificent palaces within, and the she would ride out in great processions called the fairy host, sweeping across the Irish landscape in hunts and gatherings. The processions were described as magnificent beyond mortal comprehension. The she would ride on horses, white, gray, or black, that seemed to glow with their own inner light, their hooves making no sound or sometimes making music like bells. The riders wore clothes of silk and silver, green and gold, adorned with jewelry that sparkled like stars. They carried weapons that gleamed, spears and swords that were said to be impossibly sharp, forged in the other world with skills no mortal smith could match. Some accounts describe banners flying, hounds running alongside, larger than mortal dogs, pure white with red ears, and music that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The fairy king and queen would ride at the head of the procession, crowned and terrible in their beauty. Behind them came nobles and warriors, craftsmen and poets, all the hierarchy of the fairy court made visible. The procession might stretch for what seemed like miles, hundreds or thousands of fairy folk, though whether these numbers were literal or exaggerated by enchantment or fear, no one could say. To encounter this cavalcade was considered extremely dangerous. You might be swept up with them, carried away to their realm, or simply struck down for witnessing what mortals should not see. The most common encounter was the traveler who had misjudged their journey and found themselves on the road after sunset on one of the dangerous nights. Perhaps they'd stayed too late at a neighbor's house, or their business in town had taken longer than expected, or they'd gotten lost in the twilight. Whatever the reason, they found themselves walking alone on a country road as darkness fell on Samhain Eve. There's a famous account from County Kerry about a man named Sean O'Swilliabane, and I ask your forgiveness if I am pronouncing that incorrectly. Sean was walking home from a cattle fair on Samhain night in the 1830s. He'd done well at the fair and was in good spirits, thinking of the coins in his pocket and how pleased his wife would be. The night was clear with a bright moon, and he knew the road well. He'd walked it 1,000 times. He was perhaps 2 miles from home when he heard music on the wind. At first he thought it was just the wind itself playing through the trees. But as he walked, it grew louder and more distinct, pipes and fiddles, harps and drums, playing melodies that seemed almost familiar, but not quite. As if someone had taken traditional Irish airs and transformed them into something otherworldly. Then he heard the hoofbeats. Sean's blood went cold. He knew immediately what this must be. He looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the road ran through open country here, with only low stone walls on either side and fields beyond. There was nowhere to go, no house nearby, no church where he might seek sanctuary. The music grew louder. The hoofbeats multiplied until they sounded like thunder. And then, coming around the bend in the road ahead of him, he saw them. The Ishi riding in their grand procession. The fairy host stretched back as far as he could see, a river of light and movement flowing down the road toward him. The riders glowed with a soft, silvery luminescence that made the moonlight seem dim by comparison. Their horses' manes and tails seemed to float on an invisible wind. The music surrounded everything, no longer coming from any particular direction, but simply existing, as if the very air had learned to sing. Sean did the only thing he could think of. He threw himself down into the ditch beside the road, pressing himself against the cold earth, making himself as small as possible. He turned his coat inside out, a traditional protection against fairy enchantment, and clutched the small iron nail he kept in his pocket for luck. Even though his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it. The procession rode past. It took a long time. How long, he couldn't say. Time felt strange, stretched out and compressed at once. He kept his eyes squeezed shut, but even through his closed eyelids he could see the light of them passing. The music washed over him like a physical thing, and he found himself fighting the urge to stand up, to look, to join them. Part of him wanted to, desperately, the way a moth wants to fly into a flame. But he stayed down, clutching his iron nail, reciting prayers under his breath. Ave Marias mixed with older charms his grandmother had taught him, Christian and pagan protections jumbled together in his terror. Finally, the sound faded. The light dimmed. The hoofbeats receded into the distance. Sean lay in the ditch for what felt like hours, too frightened to move, convinced that if he showed himself they would return for him. When he finally dared to raise his head, the road was empty. The moon shone down peacefully on ordinary fields and walls. But where the procession had passed, he claimed, the grass on either side of the road seemed to glow faintly, and there was frost on the ground despite it being early autumn. The air smelled different, like flowers and ozone and something else, something he had no words for. Sean ran the rest of the way home and didn't speak for 3 days afterward. When he finally told his story, the older people in the community nodded knowingly. They knew of others who had seen the grand procession of the East she on that road. It was, they said, one of the fairy paths, an ancient route the East she had used for thousands of years. Everyone knew you didn't travel that road on Samhain night, if you could help it. Another common type of encounter involved farmers or laborers who were caught working in the fields after dark. In rural Ireland, with so much work to be done and daylight hours precious, people sometimes worked until the last light faded, especially during harvest season. There's an account from County Galway about a man cutting turf who lingered too late on May Eve. He was trying to finish a particular section of the bog before the rains came, working by the last rays of twilight. He heard them before he saw them, a sound like wind, but musical, and the jingling of bridles and the soft thunder of hooves on soft ground. He looked up to see the fairy raid crossing the bog, riding across the soft peat as easily as if it were solid ground. They were heading toward one of the ancient ring forts that dotted the area, perhaps a mile away. The man knew immediately what he was seeing, and he knew he was in terrible danger. The protocol in such situations, if you couldn't hide or flee, was to show respect. He removed his cap and bowed low, averting his eyes, standing perfectly still. The procession altered its course slightly, giving him a wide berth. As they passed, he heard laughter, not mocking, but not entirely kind either, like the laughter of nobles amused by a peasant's deference. One rider, he never saw which one, for he kept his eyes on the ground, tossed something that landed at his feet with a soft thud. When he dared to look down, he saw it was a small leather purse. The procession had moved on, vanishing into the twilight toward the ring fort. The man waited a long time before picking up the purse. Inside were coins, gold coins, stamped with designs he didn't recognize, profiles of faces that looked almost human, but not quite. He took them home, unsure whether to be grateful or terrified. His wife insisted they hide them and never spend them, fearing fairy gold that might turn to leaves or stones by morning. But the coins remained real. They used them carefully and sparingly over many years, and the gold never transformed. The fairy folk, for whatever reason, had chosen to reward rather than punish his respectful behavior. But the man never worked late in the fields again, especially not on the quarter days. Musicians had a particularly complicated relationship with the Ishi, who greatly valued music and sometimes kidnapped talented musicians to play at their feasts. But they might also reward musicians who pleased them, teaching them supernatural melodies that would make their fortune. There's a famous story about a fiddler named Thomas O'Croynan from West Cork. And again, please forgive me if I am mispronouncing this name. I'm sure you can tell I'm not Irish. Thomas encountered a fairy procession while walking home from playing at a wedding. It was near dawn on May Day, and Thomas was tired and more than a little drunk from the wedding celebrations. He was walking through a particularly isolated valley when he heard music, fiddle music, but played with such skill and beauty that it made his own playing seem crude by comparison. Forgetting all caution, drawn by professional curiosity and the enchantment of the music, Thomas followed the sound. He came to a clearing where the fairy raid had stopped. They had dismounted and were having what seemed to be a celebration of their own, dancing in circles while musicians played. Thomas, emboldened by drink and fascinated by the music, stepped into the clearing and called out, "That's fine playing, but I could play better." The dancing stopped. Every fairy face turned toward him. Thomas felt the blood drain from his face as he realized what he'd done. He'd challenged the Ishi, insulted their musicians, and worst of all, he'd interrupted their revels. The Fairy King, a tall figure in green and gold, with eyes that seemed to contain stars, gestured to him. "Then play," he said, and his voice was like ice and honey mixed. "If your playing pleases us, you'll be rewarded. If it doesn't..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They handed Thomas a fiddle, not his own worn instrument, but one that seemed to be made of silver and dark wood, strung with what might have been moonlight. His hands shook as he took it. But when he drew the bow across the strings, the sound that emerged was like nothing he'd ever produced before. The fiddle played itself almost, responding to the slightest touch, producing notes of crystalline purity. Thomas played every tune he knew, and the fiddle made them sound glorious. He played until his arms ached, until sweat poured down his face, until he thought he might collapse. The fairies danced, whirling and spinning, their faces alternately delighted and severe, impossible to read. Finally, as the first true rays of dawn broke over the hills, the fairy king raised his hand. The dancing stopped. Tomas lowered the fiddle, gasping for breath. "You play well for a mortal," the king said. "Take this." He handed Tomas back his own fiddle, but now it felt different in his hands, lighter, somehow more alive. "Every tune you play from this night forward will have something of our magic in it. You'll be the finest fiddler in Munster. But remember, you can never play in a church, and you can never play the tunes you learned here tonight at a Christian wedding or funeral. These are ours alone. If you break these rules, we'll take back our gift and take your hands besides." The fairy king pointed, and Tomas saw the sun was indeed rising. The procession mounted their horses in a single fluid motion and rode away, vanishing into the morning mist. Tomas found himself alone in the clearing, clutching his fiddle, not entirely sure if he'd dreamed the whole thing, but the gift was real. From that night on, when Tomas played, people wept and laughed and danced with an abandon they'd never felt before. He became famous throughout the region, but he never played in churches, claiming his music was too wild for holy ground, and there were certain tunes he would only play late at night, alone, when no one could hear. Those who did hear them, by accident, said they were the most beautiful and terrible sounds they'd ever experienced, music that seemed to come from another world entirely. Women, particularly midwives, had their own types of encounters with the Ishi processions and the fairy folk in general. The fairies apparently needed help with difficult births, and midwives were sometimes taken, willing or not, to attend fairy women in labor. Stories tell of mortal midwives called in the night to attend difficult fairy births, taken blindfolded to magnificent palaces that turned out to be inside the local she mound. These women were rewarded handsomely, but sworn to secrecy, and woe to anyone who broke that oath. One famous account involves a midwife from County Tipperary, whom I am going to call Mare. Her full name has been preserved in history, but I can't pronounce it. As the story goes, Mare was awakened one night by knocking at her door. When she opened it, she found a dark stranger on horseback who told her she was needed urgently for a difficult birth. He offered gold for her services, and Mare, being both kind-hearted and practical, agreed. The stranger lifted her onto his horse, and they rode through the night. But Mare soon realized they were moving impossibly fast, covering miles in what seemed like moments. The landscape looked strange, familiar but somehow wrong, as if she were seeing it in a dream. They arrived at what appeared to be a magnificent mansion, though Mare could have sworn there was no such building in that location. Inside, everything was beautiful and strange, walls that seemed to be made of pearl, floors that reflected like still water, lights that came from no visible source. She was brought to a bedchamber where a woman lay in labor. The woman was beautiful beyond description, but clearly in great pain. Mare attended her, using all her skill, and eventually helped deliver a healthy baby. The dark stranger, who she now understood to be the fairy husband, paid her generously and gave her a pot of ointment, telling her to apply it to the baby's eyes. "But whatever you do," he warned, "don't let any of it touch your own eyes." Of course, Mare's nose itched while she was applying the ointment to the baby. Without thinking, she scratched it with the hand that had held the ointment. A tiny bit got into her right eye. Suddenly, she could see the truth. The magnificent mansion was actually the inside of a fairy mound, a hollow hill, its walls of earth and stone, though still somehow grand and otherworldly. The beautiful people around her appeared as they truly were, she, ageless and inhuman in their perfection, not quite real by mortal standards. Mare said nothing, finished her work, and allowed herself to be taken home. But from that night on, she could see the Ishi with her right eye, the eye that had been touched by the fairy ointment. She would see them in the market, invisible to others, choosing the finest produce. She would see them at crossroads at twilight, gathering in groups. She would see their processions when they rode out on the quarter days. For a while, this sight was a wonder. But then, one market day, she saw the dark stranger who had brought her to the birth. He was stealing butter from a farmer's stall, invisible to everyone else. Without thinking, Mare called out to him, "Good day to you." The stranger turned, his face darkening. "With which eye do you see me?" he demanded. Mare, realizing her mistake, pointed to her right eye. The stranger reached out and touched her right eye with a long, cold finger. "You'll see me no more," he said. From that moment, Mare was blind in her right eye. She never saw the Ishi again. The price for witnessing the other world uninvited was the loss of the sight that had let her see it. Perhaps most tragic were those who encountered the processions by pure accident. Children wandering where they shouldn't, people taking a shortcut through a field they didn't know was on a fairy path, travelers who simply had terrible luck with timing and location. There's an account from the 1840s of a young boy, perhaps 10 years old, who was sent by his mother to fetch water from a well after dark. It was May Eve, though the boy either didn't know or didn't understand the significance. The well was only a short distance from the house, and he'd been there 100 times. But this night, as he approached the well, he heard music and saw lights. Curious, as children are, he crept closer to investigate. The fairy procession had stopped at the well, which, unknown to most of the locals, had been a sacred spring in ancient times, a place where the boundary between worlds was particularly thin. The Ishi were watering their horses, and their company filled the small meadow around the spring with light and music. The boy watched, hidden behind a stone wall, his eyes wide with wonder. It was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, more beautiful than any fair or festival, more magnificent than anything in his small world of farm and village. Then one of the fairy horses looked directly at him, its eyes meeting his. The horse whinnied, and all the fairy folk turned to look. The boy ran. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, back toward his house, his heart pounding with terror. Behind him, he could hear laughter, not cruel, exactly, but wild and human, the laughter of beings to whom his fear was amusing. He made it home and never spoke of what he'd seen. But from that night on, he was away with the fairies, as the saying went. He would sit for hours staring at nothing, occasionally smiling as if at some invisible friend. He spoke little and seemed to hear music that no one else could hear. Sometimes he would dance alone in the fields, spinning and leaping to silent tunes. His family said the fairies had touched him, had marked him as theirs. He lived to old age, but never quite lived in the mortal world again. Part of him, they said, had gone with the fairy procession that night and never quite come back. These stories reveal the protocols and protections that developed around fairy processions. First, there are physical actions. If caught out, throw yourself down and hide, face down, not looking. Turn your coat inside out, a reversal that breaks enchantments. Carry iron, a nail, a horseshoe, any iron object. Cross yourself or recite prayers, Christian era edition. Hold your breath if they pass, to avoid breathing their air. Show respect if you must be seen, bow. Remove your hat, avert your eyes. Social protocols to observe. Never interrupt their processions. Never speak to them unless spoken to first. Never accept their food or drink. Never agree to join them, no matter how appealing the invitation. Never laugh at them or mock them. If they give you a gift, accept it respectfully but cautiously. Times and places to avoid. The quarter days, especially Samhain and Beltane. Fairy paths, traditional routes between fairy mounds. Lone hawthorn trees at night. Ancient ring forts after dark. Crossroads at twilight. Wells and springs on the dangerous nights. These encounter stories serve multiple purposes in Irish culture. On a practical level, they kept people indoors and safe during dangerous times, dark nights when travel was risky, liminal seasons when weather could turn deadly. The stories enforce social cohesion through shared belief and common caution. But they also express something deeper, a sense that the land itself was ancient and inhabited by forces beyond human control or understanding. The fairy processions represented power, beauty, and danger combined, a reminder that humans were not the only conscious beings in Ireland, that the landscape had its own history and inhabitants who predated Christianity, who remembered the old days, who followed their own incomprehensible rules. The Ishi processions were Ireland's memory made manifest. The echo of ancient gods and conquered peoples, the persistence of the past in the present, the reminder that beneath the surface of everyday life lay deeper, stranger realities. To witness them was to glimpse that hidden world, to see the veil lifted for a moment. And like all glimpses of the numinous, it was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, an experience that changed you forever, whether you wished it or not. Even today, in modern Ireland, where few literally believe in the Ishi, the stories persist. And sometimes on certain nights, in certain places, the old warnings are still whispered. Stay indoors tonight. It's not a night to be out on the roads. The good people are riding. The Ishi were also known to take human lovers, musicians, and poets into their realm, sometimes for a single night that would equal years in mortal time, sometimes permanently. The most famous example is Oisin, the great poet warrior who went with Niamh of the golden hair to Tir na Nog, the land of youth, one of the otherworld realms associated with the Ishi. He spent what he thought was 3 years there, only to return and discover that 300 years had passed in Ireland. When he stepped down from his fairy horse onto mortal ground, All those centuries crashed down upon him at once, and he crumbled into dust. The Ishi had strict taboos about their food and drink. To consume anything in their realm was to become bound to it, unable to return to the mortal world. This prohibition appears in countless Irish tales and would later echo through global fairy lore. From Persephone's pomegranate seeds in Greek myth to the Turkish delight in C.S. Lewis's Narnia. Individual members of the Ishi include some of Ireland's most famous mythological figures. The Morrigan, goddess of war and fate, is numbered among them. Manannan, god of the sea, is another. Luff of the long arm, the sun god and craftsman, Bridget the goddess of poetry and smithcraft, Angus Og the god of love and youth. All these became part of the Ishi after the coming of Christianity transformed them from openly worshipped gods into the hidden folk. More darkly, the Ishi were blamed for child abduction. Beautiful human babies might be stolen and replaced with changelings, either fairy children or elderly fairies glamored to appear as the stolen child. The changeling would be recognizable by its uncanny behavior, ravenous appetite, or strange wisdom. This belief, tragic as it was, may have been how medieval Irish communities explained children with developmental differences or illnesses, a cultural way of processing the inexplicable. The Ishi also had their own cattle, the Sheehan or fairy cattle, which were sometimes seen by mortals as strange, usually white or dun-colored herds that would vanish when approached. To take fairy cattle was possible but dangerous. They would bring prosperity, but only if treated with perfect respect. What makes the Ishi particularly fascinating is how belief in them persisted long after Christianity became dominant in Ireland. Rather than being completely dismissed as pagan superstition, they were incorporated into a complex worldview where Christian faith and fairy belief coexisted. People would go to Mass on Sunday but still leave offerings at fairy forts, would baptize their children, but also take precautions against fairy abduction. The church itself had an ambiguous relationship with fairy belief, sometimes condemning it as superstition, sometimes incorporating it into Christian cosmology as fallen angels or spirits awaiting judgment. Even today, the Ishi maintain a peculiar hold on Irish consciousness. There are documented cases within the last few decades of road construction being altered to avoid disturbing fairy forts or cutting down lone hawthorn trees. When the DeLorean car factory was built in Northern Ireland in the 1980s, workers refused to bulldoze a fairy thorn, and the tree remained standing in the parking lot. The factory famously failed, just as tradition would predict for those who disrespect the Ishi. This isn't necessarily literal belief in the old stories, but rather a cultural memory, a respect for the landscape and its history, and perhaps an acknowledgement that there are older things in Ireland than we fully understand. The Ishi represent continuity with the ancient past, a link to pre-Christian Ireland that survives in the land itself. I'll share with you one of the most famous and beautiful figures of the Ishi, Niamh, that captures both the wonder and the tragedy of encounters with the fairy folk. Niamh occupies a fascinating position in Irish mythology as a liminal figure. She exists on boundaries and bridges between worlds. She is of the other world, but actively engages with the mortal realm. She is a fairy princess but falls in love with a mortal man. She offers immortality but understands, perhaps better than Ocean does, the price of accepting it. Her association with water is significant. She first appears riding across the surface of a lake. Tir na Nog is reached by crossing the sea. Her father, in versions where he's named, is Manannan Macalair, the sea god. Water in Celtic mythology was always a boundary, a threshold between worlds. Lakes, seas, rivers, these were places where the other world pressed close to the mortal realm, where crossings could be made. Niamh, riding across water, literally embodies this threshold quality. She is the bridge between worlds, the connection between the immortal and the mortal, the fairy realm and Ireland. She makes crossing possible, but as the story shows, crossing always carries a price. In the broader context of Celtic mythology, Niamh can be compared to other fairy women who interact with mortal men. There's a whole category of such tales across Irish, Scottish, and Welsh traditions, collectively sometimes called fairy bride stories or swan maiden tales, though the swan maiden pattern is slightly different. What distinguishes Niamh from many of these other fairy women is her agency and her persistence. The typical pattern in many such tales is fairy woman is captured or tricked by mortal man, forced into marriage, eventually escapes back to otherworld, end of story. The relationship is fundamentally unwilling on the fairy woman's part. On a symbolic level, Niamh represents several things. The allure of the otherworld. She embodies everything the otherworld offers: beauty, immortality, endless pleasure, freedom from suffering. She is the promise of paradise made flesh, the temptation to leave behind the mortal world with all its pain and limitation. The impossibility of paradise, but she also represents why paradise is ultimately impossible for mortals. Even in Tir na Nog, even married to the most beautiful woman in existence, even living in perfect happiness, Oisin still longed for home. Humans need change, need struggle, need even death itself to give meaning to life. Paradise, the story suggests through Niamh, is not meant for us. The cost of choice. Niamh's tragedy is that she offered Oisin everything and he accepted, but then couldn't stay. She represents the pain of loving someone who cannot, in the end, be what you need them to be. Not because they don't love you, but because their nature is fundamentally incompatible with yours. The persistence of memory. In her eternal waiting, Niamh embodies memory itself, the way the past endures, the way lost love haunts us, the way we continue to wait for things we know will never return. Her immortality makes her a figure of perpetual remembrance, unable to forget, unable to move on. The Niamh story in its current form was likely codified sometime in the medieval period, though it certainly draws on much older traditions. The tale exists in multiple versions across Irish oral tradition and was collected by various folklorists in the 18th and 19th centuries. Some scholars see in the story a metaphor for cultural loss. Oisin represents the old Gaelic world, heroic, pagan, connected to the ancient gods. When he returns from Tir na Nog, he finds that world has vanished, replaced by a Christian, colonial Ireland where the Fianna are just legends. His physical collapse mirrors the collapse of Gaelic culture itself. In this reading, Niamh represents the temptation to retreat into the past, into memory, into a mythic golden age. Tir na Nog becomes a metaphor for cultural memory, beautiful, perfect, but ultimately inaccessible and fatal to try to live in when the real world has moved on. But Niamh can also be read as representing something more universal: the lover left behind, the road not taken, the life we didn't choose. Everyone has their own Niamh, something or someone they left behind or chose against, who waits in memory, forever young, forever calling us back to what might have been. Her enduring presence. Niamh has remained a powerful figure in Irish culture and literature. She appears in countless poems, songs, and stories beyond the original tale. W.B. Yeats referenced her in his work. She's been painted by Irish artists, set to music by composers, referenced in modern fantasy literature. There's something about her that captures the imagination. This figure of otherworldly beauty who loved a mortal man, who gave him everything, who let him go knowing he would be destroyed, and who waits still, forever faithful, forever grieving, on the shores of a paradise that has become her prison. In modern Ireland, Niamh remains a common girl's name. Parents naming their daughters Niamh are invoking this heritage: beauty, strength, love, tragedy, all bound together in a figure who represents both the wonder of the other world and the eternal sorrow of love that crosses boundaries it was never meant to cross. The legacy of the She extends far beyond Ireland. When Irish people emigrated during the famine and other periods of hardship, they brought these stories with them, planting seeds of fairy belief throughout the English-speaking world. The Ishi influenced how fairies were understood in literature, from Yeats's poetry to modern fantasy fiction. Let's explore Naima in this famous legend. Oisin in Tir na Nog, the land of youth. This tale begins in the ancient days when the Fianna, the legendary warrior band of Ireland, still roamed the land. The Fianna were led by Finn McCool, the greatest hero Ireland had ever known, and among his warriors was his son Oisin, whose name means little deer. Oisin was not only a mighty warrior, but also the greatest poet of his age, blessed with a gift for words that could make even stones weep. One morning in early summer, the Fianna were hunting near the shores of Loch Lean in Kerry. The day was bright and clear, the kind of day when the world seems more vivid than usual, when colors are sharper and the air itself seems to shimmer with possibility. The hunt had been good, and the warriors were in high spirits, their hounds running ahead through the meadows that sloped down to the lake's edge. It was then that they saw her, riding toward them across the water, not beside it, but across it, her horse's hooves barely touching the surface, sending up sprays of silver. Came the most beautiful woman any of them had ever seen. She rode a white horse that seemed to glow with its own inner light, and she herself was radiant. Her hair was the color of spun gold, flowing down past her waist in waves that caught the sunlight. She wore a dress of silk that seemed to shift between blue and silver and white, like sunlight on water, and a golden crown sat upon her head. Her eyes were the deep blue of the summer sky, but with something else in them, something that suggested depths no mortal could fathom. The Fianna stopped in their tracks, awestruck. Even the hounds fell silent. Only the sound of the horses' hooves on water broke the stillness, a sound like bells, like music, like nothing anyone had heard before. The woman rode directly to where Finn and his warriors stood and stopped before them. Her horse stood perfectly still on the surface of the lake, as if the water were solid ground. "I am Neve," she said, and her voice was like honey and silver combined. "Neve of the Golden Head, daughter of the king of Tir na Nog, the land of youth." The warriors looked at each other. They knew what this meant. She was one of the Ishi, one of the Tuatha De Danann, come from the other world. Such encounters were rare and always significant, always dangerous. "I have traveled far across the Western Sea," Neve continued, her eyes scanning the faces of the Fianna, searching for someone. "I have heard tales of the great warriors of Ireland, of the Fianna and their deeds. But I have heard especially of one among you, Oisin, son of Finn, warrior and poet both." Oisin stepped forward, his heart suddenly racing. "I am Oisin," he said. Neve's face broke into a smile that seemed to illuminate the whole landscape. "I have come for you, Oisin. I have loved you from afar, from hearing the songs sung about you, from the poems that have drifted even to our halls beneath the hollow hills. Come with me to Tir na Nog, where there is no sickness, no age, no death, no sorrow. Come and be my husband, and live forever in joy and peace." Oisin stood transfixed. He looked at this fairy princess, more beautiful than any mortal woman could be, offering him immortality and paradise. Then he looked at his father, at his companions, at the green hills of Ireland that he loved. Finn stepped forward, his face grave. "Son," he said quietly, "think carefully. The land of youth is not for mortals. Time moves differently there. Those who go rarely return, and if they do, they return to find the world they knew has crumbled to dust." But Oisin was young, and he was in love, or perhaps enchanted, for with the Ishi, it's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins. "I will go," he said, "but I will return, Father. I promise you. I will see you again." Finn's eyes were sad, but he said nothing more. He knew, as all the Fianna knew, that promises made to fairy folk and promises made by those going to fairy lands are like morning mist, beautiful but insubstantial. Neve extended her hand, and Oisin took it. She pulled him up onto her white horse behind her, and he wrapped his arms around her waist. The horse turned, and without any command that the Fianna could hear, began to move across the lake's surface. "Farewell." Oisin called to his father and his companions. "I will return." They watched as the white horse carried him across the water, moving faster and faster until it seemed to be galloping through the air itself. A mist rose up around them, golden and silver, and then they were gone, vanished as if they had never been. The journey to Tir na Nog was like traveling through a dream. They rode across the water, and beneath the waves Oisin could see wonders, towers of crystal, cities of gold, gardens of coral where strange fish swam like birds through the streets. They passed islands where music played though no musicians were visible, where feasts were laid out on tables with no one to eat them. At last they came to Tir na Nog itself, and it was more beautiful than any description could capture. The sky was perpetually the soft blue gold of a perfect summer evening. Flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in mortal tongues. The air itself seemed to shimmer with music and light. There was no winter here, no decay, no darkness. Time itself seemed to have stopped, or perhaps had never started, leaving everything suspended in eternal perfection. Niamh's father, the king of Tir na Nog, received Oisin with great honor. A wedding was held that lasted, how long? Oisin couldn't say. Days? Weeks? In Tir na Nog, such distinction seemed meaningless. The celebration flowed like music, one moment into the next, time losing all measure. And then came the years, or what Oisin thought were years, though even that became uncertain. He and Niamh lived in perfect happiness. He hunted in forests where the deer were always plentiful and never afraid. He composed poetry that even the Ishi praised. He fought in tournaments where wounds healed instantly and no one truly died. He feasted on food that was always delicious and never cloying. He loved Niamh and she loved him, and they had children who were beautiful and strange, with their mother's golden hair and their father's gift for song. It was paradise, but after what Oisin thought was 3 years, 3 perfect, unchanging years, he began to feel a strange restlessness. He found himself thinking of Ireland, of his father, of the Fianna, of the green hills and the gray rain, the smell of peat smoke and the sound of hunting horns on winter mornings. He missed imperfection. He missed change. He missed mortality itself, strange as that seemed. He went to Niamh and told her he wanted to visit Ireland just for a short time, just to see his father and his companions again, to assure them he was well, and then he would return. Niamh's face filled with sorrow. "Do not go," she said. "Please, Oisin, do not go. No good can come of returning." "I will only stay a short while," Oisin promised. "A day, perhaps 2. Then I will come back to you." "You don't understand," Niamh said, and there were tears in her eyes, the first tears Oisin had seen in Tir na Nog. "Time is different here. What seems like 3 years to you in Ireland, centuries may have passed. Your father, your companions, they are long dead and dust. The island you knew is gone." But Oisin could not believe this. 3 years could not be centuries, and even if some time had passed, surely not so much that everything he knew had vanished. Seeing she could not dissuade him, Niamh finally agreed, but with conditions. "You may take my white horse," she said, "but Oisin, you must promise me, you must swear, that you will not set foot on Irish soil. Stay mounted on the horse at all times. If your feet touch the ground of Ireland, you can never return to me, and all the years that have truly passed will crash down upon you at once." Oisin promised. He swore solemn oaths. He would stay on the horse. He would only look, speak to anyone he might find who knew the Fianna, and then return. Niamh kissed him farewell, and again there were tears on her cheeks. "I fear I will never see you again," she whispered. "I will return before nightfall," Oisin assured her. Wait for me." He mounted the white horse, and it carried him back across the sea, back through the golden mist, back toward Ireland. As they approached the shore, Oisin's heart lifted. There was the coast of Kerry, just as he remembered it. There were the mountains, the green fields, But wait, something was wrong. The landscape was the same, but everything else had changed. Where he remembered forests, there were now cultivated fields. Where there had been the wooden halls of warriors, he saw stone cottages. Strangest of all, the people he saw seemed small, not in stature, but in presence. The men working in the fields were smaller than the warriors he remembered, and they wore strange clothes and spoke with accents he didn't quite recognize, though it was still Irish they spoke. He rode toward where Finn's Hall had stood on the hill of Allen. It wasn't there. In its place was nothing but grass-covered ruins, ancient stones half buried in earth, overgrown with vegetation as if centuries had passed. Centuries. Neve had been right. Oisin rode through a land that was familiar yet utterly foreign. He stopped people and asked about Finn, about the Fianna. The older ones knew the names, but as legends, as stories from the ancient past, tales told to children about heroes who had lived 300 years ago. 300 years. He had been gone not 3 years, but 3 centuries. Everyone he had known was dead. His father, dead. His companions, dead. His entire world, dead and gone, reduced to stories and songs and half-forgotten legends. The grief that crashed over Oisin was like a physical weight. He wandered the changed landscape, a ghost in his own land, searching for anything familiar, anything that remained from his time. But there was nothing. Ireland had moved on without him. He came upon a group of men struggling to move a great stone slab. They were straining at it, many of them together, but it wouldn't budge. In Oisin's day, any warrior of the Fianna could have moved such a stone easily. These men seemed weak, diminished somehow, though Oisin realized it was he who had changed, not them. He was still strengthened by the food and drink of Tir na Nog, while these were ordinary mortal men. "Let me help you," he called down from his horse. The men looked up at this strange figure, a giant of a man mounted on a white horse that seemed to glow with its own light, dressed in clothes of a style 3 centuries out of fashion, speaking Irish with an accent from the ancient past. Oisin reached down from his horse and grasped the stone with one hand. He lifted it easily, prepared to toss it aside. And that's when it happened. The saddle girth broke. Or perhaps the stone was heavier than he thought. Or perhaps it was simply fate, inevitable from the moment he left Tir na Nog. Whatever the reason, Oisin lost his balance. He felt himself falling from the fairy horse, falling toward the ground of Ireland. Time seemed to slow. He had time to think. Niamh, I'm sorry. I should have listened. His feet touched the earth of Ireland. The change was instantaneous and terrible. All the years he had lived in Tir na Nog, all 300 years of them, came crashing down upon him at once. His strong warrior's body withered. His flesh sagged and wrinkled. His golden hair turned white and fell out in clumps. His teeth loosened and dropped from his gums. His eyes dimmed. His bones became brittle as dry twigs. He collapsed to the ground, no longer a young warrior, but an ancient, withered man, blind and frail, 300 years of age settling onto him like a crushing weight. The men gathered around him in horror, calling for help. They carried him. He was light as a child now, all his warrior's strength gone, to the nearest holy man, a monk who lived in a small stone cell nearby. This was St. Patrick's Ireland now. The old gods were fading, the old ways disappearing. Christianity had come to Ireland in Oisín's absence, transforming the land as surely as time had. The monk took Oisín in, gave him water and gentle care. And in the days that followed, for Oisín did not die immediately, clinging to life with the stubbornness of the Fianna, the old man and the saint had long conversations. St. Patrick tried to convert Oisín, to get him to accept baptism and save his soul. But Oisín, even blind and ancient and dying, remained loyal to the old ways. They argued theology and philosophy. Patrick spoke of heaven and salvation. Oisín spoke of Tir na Nog and the glory of the Fianna. "Tell me," Patrick would say, "of your father and his men. I would hear these stories, even if they are of pagans." And Oisín would tell him about Finn's wisdom, about the great hunts, about battles and feasts and the brotherhood of warriors. He composed new poems about the Fianna even as he lay dying, his gift for words undiminished by age. These poems were written down by Patrick's scribes, and thus many of the tales of the Fianna were preserved for future generations. Patrick would press him, "But surely you see that heaven is greater than this Tir na Nog? Accept baptism and you will be saved." And Oisín would reply with the defiant words that became famous. "If the Fianna are not in your heaven, then I have no wish to go there. Put me where my people are, even if that be in hell itself. I would rather be in hell with Finn and the Fianna than in your heaven without them." As for Niamh, the tales say she waited on the shores of Tir na Nog, watching for a white horse that never returned. Some say she still waits there, looking across the sea toward Ireland, mourning the loss of her mortal husband, who could not resist the pull of his homeland. After some days or weeks, the accounts vary, Oisín finally died, still unbaptized, still loyal to the old ways. Some versions say Patrick baptized him at the last moment, ensuring his salvation. Others say Oisín refused to the end, and his spirit went to join the Fianna wherever they had gone, beyond the reach of the Christian heaven. This story is one of the most profound and poignant in all Irish mythology. On one level, it's a cautionary tale about the dangers of the fairy realm, the time distortion, the impossibility of returning once you've left, the way fairy gifts turn to ashes when brought back to the mortal world. But on a deeper level, it's about the death of the old Gaelic world itself. Oisín represents ancient Ireland, the warrior culture, the pagan beliefs, the old heroic age. When he returns from Tir na Nog, he finds that world has vanished, replaced by Christianity, by smaller people living smaller lives, or so it seemed to him, by a world where the Fianna are just legends. His physical collapse when he touches the ground mirrors the collapse of the old Gaelic order when confronted with Christianity and time. He cannot exist in this new world. He is too much of the old one. Yet the tale is also about the preservation of memory. Even as Oisin dies, he tells Patrick about the Fianna, and these stories are written down. The old world dies, but the stories survive. Ireland changes, but the memory of what it was endures. And Tir nan Nog remains, always just beyond reach, always accessible but at a terrible cost. The land where nothing changes, where everything is perfect and beautiful and eternal, but which is ultimately incompatible with mortal life. For mortals need change, need time, need even death itself. Paradise, the story suggests, is not meant for human beings because we are creatures of time, and time is what gives our lives meaning. The tragedy of Oisin is that he learned this too late, that he had already made his choice when he mounted Niamh's white horse, and all his promises to return were empty before he even spoke them. The Ishi offered him everything, and in accepting it, he lost everything that made him who he was. It's a story the Irish have told for over 1,000 years, and it still has the power to break hearts because it speaks to something universal, the impossibility of going home again, the way time changes everything, the terrible price of immortality, and the eternal human longing for a paradise we can never quite reach and could never quite bear if we did. This might seem strange to modern readers. Falling in love with someone you've never met, based only on stories, but in the context of medieval Irish culture, it made perfect sense. Identity was inseparable from reputation. A person was, in a very real sense, the sum of the stories told about them. Oisin's fame as a warrior poet, his noble character as expressed through his deeds, was who he was in a way we struggle to understand in our more privacy-oriented age. So Niamh loves him, or at least she loves what she knows of him, which amounts to the same thing. And being a princess of the Owls Sea, with power and agency and the ability to cross between worlds, she doesn't wait for fate or chance to bring them together. She mounts her white horse, crosses the sea from Tir nan Nog to Ireland, and goes to claim him. When she appears before the Fianna, there's no deception, no trickery. She states clearly who she is, where she's from, and what she wants. I have come for Oisin, she says, openly and honestly. Come with me to Tir nan Nog, where there is no sickness, no age, no death, no sorrow. Come and be my husband. This directness, this clarity of purpose and desire was remarkable. The Ishi were known for their riddles, their glamours, their indirect approaches to humans. But Niamh comes honestly, offering everything, hiding nothing, except perhaps the one crucial detail about time flowing differently between the worlds. Though even that omission might not have been deceptive, it's possible she simply didn't think to mention it, or didn't fully understand how devastating the time distortion would be for a mortal. Ultimately, the Ishi are more than just fairies in the lightweight modern sense. They are the echo of ancient gods, the memory of a conquered people who retreated but never truly left, the personification of Ireland's mysterious landscape, and a reminder that the land has its own history and its own claims that predate and transcend human ownership. They are power, beauty, danger, and magic. Everything that makes the Irish landscape feel like it's holding its breath, waiting for something just beyond our perception. And so ends our journey through the lore and stories of the Ishi of Ireland. Do you believe in fairies? Have you encountered fairy spirits before? Stories of this ethereal spirit world abound across the globe. The Ishi are but one particular type of fairy in Irish lore. Stories of Ishi go back hundreds, if not thousands of years. I hope you enjoyed learning about this remarkable fairy tribe and the mysteries surrounding their realm and their interactions with humans. May the wonders of the fairy spirits carry you gently into your dreams tonight. Thanks for listening to the very end. Rest well, sleep deeply, and good night.